All right, so we are going to be covering all of the gadgets. I'm going to be covering each class individually, so I'm not going to be pairing them all together. And there are going to be repeats like the, frag grenade, flash, goo, stuff like that, because I feel like the gadgets that all classes can use actually feel a little bit stronger or weaker depending on the class. So I wanted to kind of repeat that. Now, since we have a lot to cover, I don't want to make this video last too long. I'm going to be going through some of these a little bit quicker and not fully explaining myself. So let's get right into it with Breach Charge. Also to explain the tiers here. So for S, obviously this would be like hard meta. A would be like a good pick, still in the meta. B would be like just a little bit behind, could potentially get a little bit of a tweak. C is sort of on the bad end. The niche is something that typically only works in specific compositions or to specifically counter other things. And then garbage is pretty self-explanatory. So for Breach Charge, this is going to be in B. B for Breach, the main reason is because we usually use C4 on heavy for drop, but if you don't have drop on your team, then Breach is actually a pretty underrated option. Definitely not bad. I think it is pretty solid. The only thing is it doesn't deal too much damage, whereas the C4 can deal damage to the enemy stealing, so that is why C4 can be a little bit better. It also has a bigger radius. Next we have Flashbang. This is going to be in garbage tier. Main reason is because you can flash your own teammates. Obviously, if you properly use this and don't flash your own teammates, then it could bump up to potentially C or B. There are certain moments where it can be pretty good, but I'm putting it in garbage because I really don't want to encourage a bunch of people to start bringing flashbang and flashing their own teammates. Don't get me wrong, this isn't completely useless, but I think in terms of how all the gadgets go, this one's definitely near the bottom. Next we have Frag Grenade. This is going to be an S tier. The main reason is because you basically have close to 300 damage with both of these frags. There's no indicator for it, so it's pretty easy to land these, and you can even drop them at your feet as you're getting chased and potentially win a fight by turning around. These work just basically all the time, and light, since you are sitting back and trying to deal a lot of damage most of the time, frag grenades are a fantastic pick. Next we have Gas Grenade. This is also going to be in garbage tier. I really don't like it. I'm going to actually put it behind Flashbang because I do feel like Flashbang can be a little bit more useful than Gas, but I think it's just when you're comparing what you could bring for your team, gas can hurt your team. It could prevent them from going through and chasing people. If people run away, then your teammates might have to run through the gas to chase somebody. And if you are using thermal vision or if there's smoke on the ground, you might not be able to see it. Overall, it's pretty darn shit. And realistically, I would much rather just somebody bring frag grenades, which don't damage your teammates, which have instant damage up to about 150. 149 is going to be the typical number. On very rare cases, you can get the 150 if you are standing perfectly on it. But with gas, I could throw it perfectly at somebody, have it pop. They might even stand in it for like 2 seconds, then leave, and I got maybe 20 damage on them. And it can be removed pretty easily with fire, so I just think gas is really bad. Gateway, S tier. Even above frag grenade, this is one of the best picks. In the game, I freaking love Gateway. It can be used in so many different ways. It has an insanely high skill gap. It can be good for transferring cash boxes. It can be good for saving your teammates. It can be good for getting out of fights. It can be good for repositioning, for kiting. It has an endless amount of use cases. The smarter you are, the more you understand the game, the better Gateway becomes. And this is a mandatory pick on basically every single light loadout that I ever build. It is fantastic. Next we have Glitch Grenade. So this is also going to be in S tier. I know we're going to have a lot of S tiers, but I do think that some of the gadgets that you can bring as light are just fantastic. Now, the thing is that glitch is a very, very good counter to stuff like heavy. However, it's not that good versus other lights. It's a little bit harder to land it. So that's kind of why it's at the bottom. I honestly think it could potentially go A. I'm going to actually leave it here at the top of A and potentially reorganize it a little bit later. But glitch grenades are definitely one of those picks that I use a lot of the time. But the things to keep in mind is like if there's not many dome shields, if there's not many mesh shields that you're facing, if there's not many things to just kind of instantly impact with glitch, then it can kind of fall out of line. It might not be as good. Glitch barrels also kind of replace it, so I guess there are a little bit more downsides than initially thought, but I do think A is a pretty safe spot. Goo Grenade, it's going to go in B, only on light. I think Goo Grenade is fantastic. I think the other classes utilize it a little bit more, and we'll get into that when we get to them. But I think when it comes to light, realistically, this is a panic cover. And I think when you are pairing with something like Grapple, there are tons of really fun utilizations with Goo and Grapple where you can make little ledges to grapple onto and sit on. So I think goo is really good when paired with the right things. But as a general rule of thumb, goo is sort of like a compensation for when you make a mistake on light. And I think realistically, like if you have good positioning and movement, then you might not want to bring this. You might want to bring something else that can help your team a little bit more. But goo is not bad. Definitely a pretty solid pick overall. Then we have Gravity Vortex. The Gravity Vortex is actually going to go at the top of A. The more that I use this, the better it kind of gets. There are so many use cases, and as you can see, I only have level 3 on it. So there's still many things that I need to learn, but the 25-second cooldown is just kind of crazy. How long it lasts is about like 7 seconds. So if you already have one placed, and then you use it, then throw another one, and then you activate that, then you're only going to have to wait, potentially like 10 seconds before your next Gravity Vortex is up. Like, being able to stall with this is insane, and learning where to place them and how to properly utilize them is really, really key. People are going to have to hunt and find where they are, so if you're just simply placing it on the cache box, it might not pull the cache box far enough, and you might think this is useless, or they're just shooting it. But if you're smart with your placement, then you can really, really stall the cache outs really well, and it kind of almost replaces that whole C4, especially on maps like Kyoto, where it's really hard to get cache outs that are like on floors where you can drop a C4, and it's better to just winch them out in the open, and then you can use Gravity Vortex to stall while they're in the open. So I think Gravity Vortex is fantastic. I think in the final round, it loses a little bit of value, whereas Gateway and Frag keep their value in final round. Same with Glitch, it also has pretty good value in final round, but how good they are in cache out, I think is just going to keep getting better and better. This could potentially move up to S tier, depending on the strategies that evolve. Pyronade, garbage tier. This is probably one of the worst gadgets in the game, which is why I'm putting it at the very back of garbage. I think Pyro just sucks. It barely does damage. It has like an impact damage of like 5 damage. So you could potentially just do like 5 to 10 damage on somebody with this thing. You can even like quickly run through it and not even take damage sometimes. It doesn't last very long. Sure, you can do some damage through the floor with it, and there's little tricks like that, but you can also just bring smoke and cancel it out. If there's some smoke barrel nearby, you can remove it. If you're trying to take out goo, it takes way too long to burn it. Realistically, Pyro Grenade is just a really, really bad pick. It's a complete bait pick. I would not be using anything in garbage tier. I think, honestly, Flash could potentially move up to C, but it's one of those things that's like you have to fully understand how to utilize it, and your team has to be able to capitalize on how to use it as well. Because honestly, I'd rather bring Flash than either Gas or Pyro. These are just horrible picks, and they are noob traps. I feel like a lot of like low elo players, casuals, like quick play, stuff like that, like you're seeing tons of these in like really low elo lobbies, but the higher you go, these become non-existent. Like it's laughable whenever I run into a gas grenade or a pyro grenade when I'm in like Ruby lobbies. Smoke grenade is going to be in B tier. I actually think that this is fantastic for like stealing, and on light you can actually combo it with thermal vision. It does take up 2 slots, which is why I'm putting it at B. It could be a little bit better, but it kind of needs that thermal vision to fully utilize. And even if you don't have thermal vision, I think it really, really helps for giving your team cover for stealing. So it is a bit of a niche pick. And I guess for that reason, I would put it in niche, but I would say it sort of sits in the B tier, but it is kind of a niche pick. Next, we have the Sonar. Sonar is kind of a C tier. I think if you are a solo queue player and you're not using your mic and you're just playing with randoms, then this is probably like an A tier pick. It is really good to have Sonar Grenade on your team. This is essentially giving the intel out, but as a light, your job is to gather intel and feed that back to your team. You need to be very good at communication and giving them intel. And for that reason, I think it is C tier, because if you are doing your job as light correctly, you do not need a Sonar Grenade. Next, we have Stun. I'm putting this in A tier and kind of a little bit further back in A tier, because pretty much everything ahead of it here, we have the Glitch, Vortex, Frag, and Gateway, are more than likely things that I'm probably going to be bringing in before I bring in Stun personally, but I still think it is a pretty good A tier pick, because there are tons of times where you can stall, you can get picks on enemies, you can set up your team for kills. There are plenty of use cases for Stun Gun, which is why I think it is a pretty solid pick. And if you are using like Cloak and XP, for example, which is a pretty common loadout, then Stun with Glitch and Gateway is a pretty good combination. Being able to stun enemies with the Cloak and then getting free headshots on them is really good. But if you are sitting further back, like using an LH1, then you might want to bring, Gateway, Frag, and Glitch, maybe even the Vortex, so that you can sit further back and utilize that full range. But again, if you're like the close range engagement, the mid-range engagement, the Stun Gun is pretty good. If you're sitting further back, it falls a little bit out of line. So that is why I think Stun Gun is at A, because it has a lot of situations where it is good. And honestly, you could probably bring it every round and wouldn't be an issue. Next, we have Thermal Bore. I really want this to be good. And at first, I kind of thought this might be like a better Breach Charge because you can do it at range. But Breach Charge allows you to basically just play without even line of sight. Where the Thermal Bore, you do need line of sight. There is a little bit of that delay with it. And if they already have APS set up, then the Breach Charge that could already be set up on the cash out probably is going to be a little better, and it would be playing it for drop. There are certain cases where you might be trying to approach a building and you need to get through a wall, so Thermal Bore in that case can be good. The only thing is that Dematerializer with 3 charges, it being a specialization, instant activation, kind of does what Thermal Bore does, but a little bit better. And it kind of does it a little bit quieter, faster, and you can also reclose those holes without needing something like goo. So Thermal Bore for me is just not as good, but Breach Charge plays drop a little bit better, so that's why it's going to be sitting in C. And I do want to bump it up a little bit because I feel like Thermal Bore still has some decent use cases, like if you're using LH1 and sitting a little bit further back, opening up lines of sight on cash out can be the difference between you winning or not, but that is only because you want to fully utilize that position rather than moving to a position where you don't even need Thermal Bore, which in that case, it might be better to use something like Gravity Vortex or whatever to be able to pull them into that line of sight and keep them there. So Thermal Bore for me is C tier, and I don't really know how to fully buff this in order to make it a higher tier. Next, we have Thermal Vision. So this goes with Smoke Grenade and Niche. I'd actually put this in A tier because it is fantastic at countering other cloak lights. But again, that is a niche situation. If you're not seeing a bunch of other lights, then you probably have no use case for Thermal Vision. If you're not bringing smoke, then again, you don't have any use case for Thermal Vision. So it's not one of those things that you want to bring in all the time. I think it's pretty self-explanatory why it should sit in Niche. Then we have the Tracking Dart. This is actually going to be behind Sonar Grenade in C tier. Kind of gives the same intel, but the thing is the Tracking Dart sort of tracking outline just feels annoying. Like it's almost like a lower FPS version of where the player is. So sometimes you might think that there's somewhere that the Tracking Dart says it is, but they've already moved past that because it's slowly updating. So it can almost make it harder to shoot your enemy. So I think they need to polish that up and make the tracking almost like perfect. And sure, that might be pretty strong, but I think it would help it get out of C tier, maybe into A or B tier. But for me, I think Tracking Dart is a pretty bad pick. One of the worst picks, but I'd still bring it over, Gas or Pyro. Next, we have Vanishing Bomb. I think this sits in B because there are certain situations where it's good, especially when you're using melee, but it doesn't really combo well with a lot of other options on the class. And sure, you could bring Dash and then Vanish Bomb and say, sure, I have Cloak and Dash, but realistically, that is not at all how it plays. If I am using Dash or Grapple, I don't even bring Vanishing Bomb. I think if you're going to play Cloak, you play Cloak. If you're going to bring Vanish Bomb, it's because you really need to utilize that Cloak in some sort of way, whether it be like using a gateway and then you Vanish Bomb with your entire team and push through it. If you're using melee and you need that extra millisecond of time where people don't spot you, or if you're sitting a little bit further back and you need to push up. There are those use cases, but realistically, I would much rather bring something from the S or A tier before I'd ever touch something like the Vanishing Bomb. But I'd still probably use it over most things in C tier, and when it comes to my loadouts, I typically use everything in A and S tier in my regular slots and my reserve, and then extra things in my reserve would typically be Thermal Vision because it has those niche cases of countering lights really hard, which is why I like it. I don't really touch things in C tier too much. I know you can see that I have level 8, level 7 on a lot of things here, and that's because I like using everything and I like trying to fully learn this game. So that is why a lot of these things are high level, but not necessarily in the way that like, oh, I thought it was really good, so I wanted to use it. It's just, let me master it. Let me actually give it the time and effort that it deserves, and then I can make a judgment on it. All right, so next we're going to be covering the gadgets on medium. And again, we have some of these repeated ones. So right off the bat, let's just get it over with. Pyro and Gas. I'm going to be going into garbage tier. Same reasons as I said before. I think these are awful. And we'll start from the front here. So APS turret, I'm going to be putting in B tier. And the main reason that it is not higher or lower, and I think it's in a pretty even state, is because there are a lot of situations where it's good. Countering frag grenades, countering RPGs, countering C4s. Yes, even C4s. You can actually winch or drop a cash out. Say you drop it with the Dematerializer and it falls into the APS. it will remove C4 on the point. Same with winching it into the APS. So there are plenty of use cases for this that I don't think it falls into that niche category, because realistically, you're going to see tons of frags, tons of glitches, tons of RPGs, tons of C4s, and tons of other things. You know, even if people aren't bringing that, they might be bringing goo or smoke or whatever. Like, there are tons of throwables that the APS can counter, and it's going to be a little bit stronger depending on how many of those things you need to counter. But I think there are plenty of use cases, and if you build your strategies around this, this can be pretty strong, but it isn't good in every single situation. I think it is a pretty solid pick, and it should be at least in your reserves, especially if you're like a healing or dematerializer medium. Next, we have the data reshaper. Again, pretty niche, but I think this is more niche. Like, if you're seeing a lot of mines and a lot of turrets, even a lot of people who aren't hiding their C4s or their gravity vortexes, then you can counter it with the data reshaper. This even removes lockbolt, launcher, anchors, so it can be pretty good at dealing with those. So again, it's one of those, if you're running into a lot of situations where this can counter the enemy's gameplay, then definitely bring it in. Next, we have the defibrillator. I think after the nerf that this thing is not quite as useful, and I want to put it in B tier. Now, on my team, we actually don't really like running the defib anymore, because the logic is essentially like, if we have to bring somebody back with defib, they're going to be useless during that fight. I would much rather us bring something like frag grenade or even goo for more defense, something like that, in order to survive a little bit longer or to engage and win that fight a little bit better. I think if we're falling back on like plans where, oh, if we fail this fight a little bit, then we can defib and keep going, then I feel like we're not really going into the fights with the correct mindset, and I would much rather us just fully try to win those fights and play very aggressively or fully defensive, not sort of in the middle ground where defib might be a little bit stronger. And I think defib is pretty bad unless you have heal, which we don't typically run healer, we just run a dematerializer. So for that reason, the defib is just going to be in B tier, because it's still pretty good. And if you're solo queue, honestly, this could be like an S or an A tier, because just bringing your teammates back is going to be a pretty common thing, especially when they're not so coordinated. Then we have the explosive mine. This is going to go into C tier. I think when you actually know that people are running mines, especially in high elo, we instantly start to adapt. We know how to play around this, and it might be able to catch you out the first time, but the further the game goes along, the less likely you are to capitalize on this. Now, for medium, I actually think flashbang is a little bit better. Now, on light, we had it a little bit lower. We had it in C tier and even garbage tier for a little bit, but I think it belongs more in B tier on medium class. And the main reason is because we have the model 1887, which is fantastic for close range and a pretty common pick that you see on the class. Another thing is that you are meant to set up your teammates, which means that you are often around your teammates and you know where they are, you're helping move them around, so you can set up fights for them a little bit better. Lights can kind of do this, but since they play a little bit more selfishly, a little bit more solo, there's plenty of times where you don't fully get to utilize flashbang like a medium could. So for that reason, I'm going to bump it up to B tier. So this isn't too much of a gain in power, but it is a little something. Next, we have frag grenade. S tier again. Again, no indicators, massive damage, relatively short cooldowns, and it pairs well with this class, especially if you are facing any winch or heavy players or something like that. Being able to just throw these frag grenades at the enemy's feet as your team pushes in is really good. When you're sitting back watching your heavy push in, you can just start throwing frag grenades, because if the enemies start pushing back into your team, then the frag grenades are just going to blow up and you could potentially just win that fight. Or they start pushing back and you can start getting control and more aggressive on them. Closing the distance is really good, so even if you're not doing damage, this can still do something for your team. Now, gas mine, I find this is actually more useful than the gas grenade, but again, it has that problem of potentially hurting your team. So this is a really good defensive thing. So if you've already plugged something and you are setting up defenses for it, the gas mine is actually pretty solid. I would say it's better than the explosive mine, purely because you can just place it on the cash out. Now, they can shoot it and then, oh, there's a bunch of gas now on the point, and you can shoot it yourself if they're trying to steal off of it, but you can just keep rotating. You got 2 gas mines, you can throw one, throw the next one, you shoot one, then by the time that gas is down, you shoot the next one, then you have your cooldown of the gas mine, you throw the next one, shoot that, and you can just keep cycling your gas. It combos pretty well with like dematerializers, so you can get weird angles on it that people might not be looking for you from. But I think gas mine, if you want to play into that, is pretty decent, but it only plays into that sort of defensive play, whereas you could probably just throw frag grenades at the point and also do something during other fights as well as defensive fights. So I think Gas Mine just doesn't really shine as much as some of the other options here. But I still think that there are some use cases for it where it could be decent. Glitch Trap is an A tier, pretty solid at countering specific things. It is a little niche, but I think even then it's like it can affect anybody really, but it affects Cloaking Device, Dash, and Mesh Shield, even Winch, and Dematerializer. It affects Healing Beam like pretty strong, like more so than a lot of the other picks and like a lot of the other gadgets that you might be running into. I think Glitch Trap is a pretty solid choice, even putting it near your cash out so that way when they go to steal, they don't have any gadgets or specializations to defend from until they deal with it. You can even throw this on statues and make it really hard for enemies to defib. So Glitch Trap is definitely a pretty solid pick. I like having it in my reserves, but it's not something I often pick up because I do feel like the gameplay around it is quite boring, but it is still a pretty solid pick to consider. Now Goo is up here in A tier. I think Goo is a fantastic pick on medium, being able to make cover for your teammates while they're stealing, because oftentimes you are the person stealing as the medium player, so throwing a Goo for cover and then start stealing is really, really freaking solid. And then on top of that, if you're using Dematerializer, you don't even have to use the DMAT. You can just throw a Goo to close holes after you open them, which allows you to save that extra charge if you need to keep running through and make more and more holes for kiting. Opening up 3 walls and then closing one with Goo means that if anyone's chasing you, it's going to be much, much harder for them to chase. So I think Goo is a fantastic pick on this class. And if you really, really spend the time to learn it, it is great, which is why it's going to go at the top of A tier here. I think it has a massive skill curve to it. I think just picking it up, it's a very easy thing to understand. Sure, I got some free cover. Oh, I might be able to, prevent somebody from moving through this line of sight. But then the more that you get into it, there's so many different strategies. And I think Goo Grenade is a fantastic pick. There are probably times where I think this would be better than Frag Grenade, but Frag Grenade is just simply easier to use. So that is why the Frag Grenade is at S tier, because Goo Grenade, it just requires big brain and it requires you to fully understand it. So there are a lot of times where it's easier to mess up your Goo Grenade, whereas Frag Grenade is pretty simple. Then we have the Jump Pad. This is actually going to be a S tier pick. I think basically everybody should be having Jump Pad on their kit as a normal thing. It's basically at the top here. Even after the cooldown nerf, I still think that this is fantastic. I don't really know how you can make a better, more well-balanced kind of gadget that is really strong because I guess, is it balanced if it's S tier? I still think it kind of is because it's very simple to understand. Nobody really complains about it. You can just shoot it if you're the enemy. You can also use it if you're the enemy. It's not this very frustrating thing to deal with like the old Glitch Trap was. It felt extremely oppressive and was annoying. And sure, you could shoot it to try and deal with it, but the Jump Pad it feels so nice. There's a lot of complexity to it as well, making it really good when comboed with Slant Pads, even throwing a Goo Grenade and then putting the Jump Pad on that. Realistically, I just think that the Jump Pad is a fantastic pick. Definitely an S tier. Now let's move on to the proximity sensor. I think this is niche, but I think this is almost like garbage tier. I'm going to put it in niche because there are some okay use cases for it, but I just think overall that this doesn't really pair that well. And especially if you are playing with a bunch of other people who are giving you good communication, who are scouting well, who are positioning well, proximity sensor might not be that good. But if you are in solo queue and there are those niche situations where you might want to set up some intel gathering proximity sensors around the map, so that way as enemies start approaching you, then you might have that angle, that intel that your team now has as well, because you guys might not be in comms, you might not be able to communicate that well to them, but the proximity sensor could give them the information. So I think it is a niche pick. I would say if you are 3-stacking or if you're in really high elo, do not use the proximity sensor. It's really not that good. But again, niche cases where it might have some uses. Now the Smoke Grenade, I think when it comes to using it on medium and heavy, realistically, the Smoke Grenade is not that good. And if the enemies are running thermal, then you're just going to kind of grief yourself out. But I'm putting in C tier because as the medium, your job typically is the person who should be stealing. You don't want your light on it. They die way too quickly. One grenade could potentially just be the end of your light. And if you are medium, then you could potentially survive a little bit more. You're also a little bit smaller than heavy, so heavy can stand inside of your body so that you can have your heavy take all of the stuns. They can winch enemies closer and finish them off if they're trying to shoot at you, or they can use Mesh Shield to block shots for you. You don't want your heavy stealing because of how much blocking they can do. You don't want your light stealing because the stuns and all the DPS allow them to keep you alive as enemies start trying to close on you. But the medium is the perfect one to steal, and for that reason, smoke can be a pretty okay choice for stealing, but I think the goo grenade probably does a better job at just making cover for you without ruining your line of sight. But it is an option there if you want, especially if you have a light that's running thermal. Then we have Zipline going in A tier. I'm actually going to move this up in A tier because I think the Zipline, after the nerf with the cooldown, I think it hurt it a little bit because this was one of the few things that we did kind of rotate out. I mean, jump pad is basically in every single rotation of gadgets on this class. The frag grenade is super common as well. If it's not on the main class, it's on the reserve. Goo grenade as well. And then the zipline was definitely one that we had pretty much all the time. So I think at the moment, the first four here, the jump pad, frag, goo, and zipline would typically be what I rotate between, even if I'm healing. The only thing that I might bring in after that would be defibrillator for healing, and then the APS might be in reserve along with glitch trap. But if I'm on dematerializer, it's basically just those first four, so jump pad, frag, goo, and zipline. Now to cover heavy and all of their gadgets, I feel like heavy definitely has some of the better gadgets in the game, especially for team play, which actually means that some of the other things that are neutral might actually be sitting a little bit lower, but we will get to those when we get to those. First things first, let's just get this out of the way. These just suck. Please stop using gas grenades. Please stop using pyro nades until they're buffed. These things are god-awful picks. They're not good. Sure, you can tell me about how you ended up getting a triple kill with a gas grenade and power shift. I do not care. They suck. Keep it to yourself. They're genuinely some of the worst picks. Now, anti-grav cube, niche pick. There's actually some cool tech with it, like you can slide and jump into it in order to essentially give yourself a mini jump pad. So being able to get on roofs is a little bit quicker. You can also winch stuff into it, which helps fling things a little bit further. You can also throw this at people who are getting defibbed, because after they get defibbed, they're going to be floating in the air, a little bit vulnerable, makes it a lot easier to shoot them. So there are a lot of niche scenarios where this is good. And I like bringing this with Goo Gun simply because I can make some interesting little cocoons and put the cash out in pretty weird spots. I like this gadget a lot. I think it's really cool. I wish it was a little bit more versatile, but realistically, this is a pretty niche pick. But I do enjoy it a lot. Barricade, definitely an A tier. You can use it in a lot of situations. It's not the first thing that I'm putting in my class. It's not like a mandatory thing, but it's almost always in my reserve. Being able to give yourself some cover is really good. And the one thing about it is it's a little bit harder to use indoors or around certain angles, but if you know when and where you can place this and you play around those areas, it's a lot stronger. I think the struggle that people have with this is adapting to your positioning, making sure that you're not, standing right near a ledge or always inside of a door or a window frame where you can't actually place these. Make sure you're playing around angles where you have a little bit more open space. And being the tank, you shouldn't be too shy at positioning yourself like that. C4, A tier. This is fantastic. Don't get me wrong. I think it's really good. But now that we have Breach Charge, we have Gravity Vortex, we have Stun on Light, and Light is finally back in the meta, I feel like we can safely put this away. And then also we can just winch stuff into the open. So if we're winching stuff right into the open, then we don't really necessarily need the C4. But playing for drop is still extremely, extremely, extremely valuable, and it will never not be. So for that reason alone, I think C4 has to stay in A tier. It can't go any lower. Even if you are dropping it, even if you're using it, whatever, like you understand that C4 has a lot of versatility around the cash out specifically. And even then you can engage with it. You can have people get chased into it and then set up a C4 RPG play where you just basically just melt somebody, one-shotting a lot of enemies. So C4 is a fantastic pick, and I think it should stay in A tier, but I don't think it's mandatory, which is why we have it in A tier and not S tier. Dome Shield, S tier. After the nerf, a lot of people were panicking, saying, oh my god, it's going to be so bad. What the hell? It's too short. Why are we shorting this? Like, Heavy's getting so nerfed. And then as time went on, lo and behold, basically every single person who uses Heavy is still having Dome Shield on every single loadout. I think the only times that I don't use this is if I'm using like Goo Gun, because I like using Goo Gun with Anti-Grav and Barricade, because I feel like Barricade with the Dome feels a little bit more interesting. There's a little bit more interaction there. But other than that, Dome Shield is in every single loadout. And even then when I'm on Goo Gun, I'm like, wow, I really wish I had a Dome Shield as well. But we kind of have to sacrifice some things to make certain playstyles work, but realistically, the dome shield is fantastic all the time. Explosive mine is going to go into C tier. I think with so many other options on this class, like C4, even pyro mine, RPG, like there's not really like many use cases for bringing an expo mine. I think there's a lot of other things on the class that just do it better. So for that reason, it's just in C tier. I don't think it's garbage, but it is C tier for this class for sure. Now we have the flashbang, and I'm gonna put flashbang in niche for this. I know it's been moving around a lot, but I think when you pair this with some of the melee, it can be really, really strong and almost funny. And you can even bring this with winch and like a KS or something. You throw this into a room and you just try and winch all the blind people running around. It is a little bit niche, but since you are the first person in there, if you're throwing flashbang, this can prevent your team from going in if they were staring at it and getting ready. And since you're in a lot of people's faces, if you're trying to throw flashbang, it makes it a little bit harder, because if you're already in someone's face, then you obviously don't want to throw a flashbang. It's just a little bit tricky to compare with something like barricade. You throw it, then place a barricade for the cover, and then once it pops, then you hop over. There's some use cases that's a little niche, but it's not as like versatile as it would be on some of the other classes where I can actually put it in a category. I think with heavy, it just feels very weird because it doesn't quite combine with some of the meta loadouts, but some other off-meta loadouts could potentially utilize it. Frag grenade, going to be in A tier here. I kind of like having the frag grenade to replace the C4. And even after the RPG nerf, I still feel like the frag grenade might not be as good. Now, obviously in the other classes, the frag grenade was like an S tier. It's really good. But with what we have in the heavy class, like it's not comparable. Even though it might be just as strong, a lot of the other things in heavy, these gadgets are insane. So it's like, if I want to be fair to each class individually, the frag just doesn't compare to some of the other things. So it's kind of at the bottom of A tier, could potentially even be B tier. But I think in final round, I use it a little bit more. And then on certain loadouts, you can potentially drop RPG for the frag. Up to you, a little bit personal preference. I think that frag grenade sort of sits near the bottom of A tier, maybe even B tier, but we're going to leave it here. Now, glue grenade, B tier. It combos quite well with like charge and slam and even winch to a degree. Not so much mesh, but you can kind of use this like a barricade. But the more that I've used them both, originally I thought goo might be better. But once you start understanding how to properly use goo and properly use barricade, you kind of realize that the barricade does have a little bit more use cases, especially around like stealing and setting up defenses for your team. The barricade just feels a little bit better than goo. Goo is a little bit more makeshift, and there are certain scenarios where the goo is a little bit better, which is why I would kind of keep it near the high end of B, and barricade sort of sits in the middle, low end of A. They are pretty close, and I wouldn't say that you're wrong for bringing goo over barricade. It could totally be personal preference, but I think in my mind, the barricade is better. Now, lockbolt. Okay, I'm going to put this in niche because solely on the reason that they've kind of mentioned that they nerfed this, the ability to kind of put this on cash outs, and they wanted to kind of rework it in the future or do something with it. So as it stands, I really don't know where it should sit once it comes back in the meta. Once they've reworked this or gonna give it another buff, then maybe we can kind of revisit it and talk about it again. But like I wouldn't really use it right now. It's kind of garbage. Before the nerf, I would say it's potentially like B, maybe even A tier. We didn't really get to explore all the potential that it has in like the competitive scene. So I'm just gonna put it at niche because I just don't want to put it in one of these categories right now because I don't really know what role it even should play in because it's just kind of getting reworked. So it's a little unfair. Proximity sensor on heavy is garbage. You're not the scout. You're always sticking with your medium. You need to basically play off of your medium and you need to be the first one in. So your team should be the one gathering intel and then you need to capitalize on it. A lot of the things that are on this class are very, very freaking strong. So I would not be the one bringing proximity sensor. If you really desperately want to put proximity sensor in your team comp, heavy should not be the one using it. It is garbage. Still better than gas and pyro though. Then we have the pyro mine. I would actually put this at B tier. It is a better explosive mine. Realistically, this thing is actually pretty solid. You get 2 charges of it. It leaves a lingering fire. So that means that you can put it at doorways. You can put it on the cash out. And if they have to break it, then, oh, well, now they have a area where they can't really walk without taking some damage. And it does some pretty significant damage, especially if you are ready to capitalize on somebody walking on it. You start shooting them, then they either have to push forward into you, which is exactly what you would want as like a tank. And if they run away, they have to go back into the fire. So Pyromine for me is a very, very solid pick, but it's definitely not as useful as some of the other things, but pretty good, and it combos well with certain things, which is why it's like really good in certain scenarios. Like if you use like MGL, for example, then the Pyromine is a pretty good combination. The RPG, definitely here. I mean, it's even after the nerf, I think a lot of people said like it was dead, they're not going to bring it anymore. And then as time went on and people kept using it, well, the RPG just kind of came back in the meta, and it was really, really good. I still think you could replace it with Frag Grenade if you really want. Frag Grenade has the potential to do more damage, but RPG with that instant impact, even being able to open up walls, some of the utility that it brings is pretty solid. So for that reason, it just pairs so well with the class. It does what it needs to do. It's really hard to put the RPG in a place where it isn't S tier, and that is pretty clear after all the damage nerfs and still that high up. Smoke Grenade on heavy is garbage, but it's still used over gas and pyro. Yeah, the Smoke Grenade is just so bad for this class. Like, again, if you're facing anybody with thermal, you're just cooking yourself. You're not the one stealing, so this isn't your job to kind of like throw smoke on your teammates that are stealing. Like, you should just mesh, use barricades, dome shields to cover them. Don't bring smoke to try and help them out. Like, if you're going to bring like defensive stuff, if you want to bring like barricade, dome, and mesh, like none of those should be replaced with a smoke grenade for cover. It's just kind of garbage when you compare it to what you could bring on the class. And as you see, again, pretty much everything in the S and A would be what I have on my class and in my reserves. And then some of the stuff in niche, like the Gravity Cube and Lock Bolt, might also be in the reserves, just for those situations where I think it's pretty good, or if I'm bringing Goo, I really like using the Gravity Cube with it. Might not be meta with Goo, but I think it's a really fun combo, so that is why I do it. So that is my gadget tier list for ranked in Season 5. Now, hope you guys all had a good holiday. Hopefully I'm going to go back to my regular schedule of about 2 videos a week, maybe throw in some shorts there for the next year. For December, I try to pump out as much content as I could. I probably just can't realistically keep it up, but I'm hoping you guys enjoyed the flood of content throughout the season, and I look forward to the future of the finals and making content for it. So get out there, have fun with all the S tier gadgets, and I will see you in the finals.